so much. So it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon to be joined by our four panellists. We're going to talk, I think, for, well, up to about an hour. It's going to be very much an informal conversation. There'll be time for questions at the end, but if anything burning comes up or things are going slowly and you think we should be picking things up or whatever, do jump in or put your hand up. That would be great. On the way here today, I realised that I was in an embarrassing situation of not being able to, I didn't know how to pronounce the title of the exhibition. And I think since being here, since a couple of hours ago, I've heard different kinds of pronunciations of the title. So it's Qwaypurlake?
It's Qwaypurlake.
Qwaypurlake. Okay, you were saying it differently.
I said it wrong.
Okay, so we cleared that up. Qwaypurlake. So I think, yeah, we're going to talk a bit about the exhibition. I think probably, Simon, we can start with you by talking about that, but then talk more broadly about the work of Marie, Ian and Daphne, how that fits into the show and about, you know, what they're thinking about and working on at the moment. So Simon, maybe we can talk a little bit about the background to the exhibition,
sure.
how it came about, where that difficult to pronounce title came from and so on.
Yeah, the difficult to pronounce title is, in a way, that's the very... that's the kernel of the show. That's where the idea came from. Because I don't know how many of the audience are from Bruton or familiar with kind of Bruton and the area around. I live in Frome, which is sort of 15, 20 minutes in that direction. And the long road that joins Frome to Bruton ends just before you hit the high street. And that road is called, I thought, Qwaypurlake Street. But then when I was invited to do the show here, and that's been in my head for quite a few years, what a strange name it was, and I didn't know what it meant, and I looked it up and I couldn't find any real explanation of it. And when Alice Workman, the director at Hauser Wirth, invited me to do the show, and we started talking about ideas, I said, well, I think I want to possibly name it after that road that, you know, blah, 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 I just explained, and call it Qwaypurlake. And Alice said, no, you can't do that because the locals call it Qwaypurlake. And I was like, but that just sounds silly. It can't be Qwaypurlake, it sounds like a duck or something, you know. And I want the show to be like really dark and mysterious and science fiction-y, and it'll have a name like a duck. That would be really weird. And so we started talking about lots of things around how we were going to form the exhibition and the ideas that were going to be in it. And one of the ideas that I wanted to play around with was ideas of language and naming things and the way that names can have significance or convey significance without necessarily you understanding what they mean. So as the idea for the show developed, the idea of messing around with language and taking the name of the street but starting to phonetically play around with that so that it's spelt in a different way to try and stress a certain kind of pronunciation, and also just so people have that simple encounter when they go, I'm not quite sure what how am I supposed to say, is it Qwaypurlake, and so that the exhibition had a little bit of kind of independence or something, like you had to try and wrestle with it a little bit.
Because when I first read about the show, Qwaypurlake didn't strike me as particularly sci-fi at all or dystopian. It had much more of a kind of Lewis Carroll kind of feel to it, almost like a Jabberwocky kind of feel to it. Of where it's like that, as with all nonsense poetry, it's familiar and yet somehow other. You can imagine what a Jabberwocky looks like. You could maybe imagine what this place Qwaypurlake might look like. Yeah,
and I think the fact that it had the per sound in the middle is quite soft, you know, and then a lake, we all know what a lake is. So you just have that kind of, you half know it and you half don't know it. And that was really central to the idea of trying to play around with what I tend to call them conceits, you know, like ideas that you've woven for an exhibition that are deliberately kind of staged in a way, you know. So this is very much about the idea of thinking about making an exhibition like you might think about writing a story or starting to make a film, and having those kind of storyboarded ideas and then working with the artists and having conversations with the artists and bringing works together that start to make that narrative come to life, you know.
And so, yeah, I mean, perhaps if question to any of the artists when Simon first got in touch with you with this kind of idea, because there is this idea of Qwaypurlake, but then also this fictional watery future as well. You know, it's quite this conceit here. Yeah, how did you
Well,
respond?
he came to see me with the idea, and I'm not a great one for group exhibitions. I tend not to do many of them. So I'm always slightly suspicious. But he mentioned a book that he started talking about Stanisław Lem's book, Solaris, and I'm a big fan of the book, which describes, of those of you who haven't read it, describes a kind of planet which is a membrane, like a sea. A moving sea with a spaceship hovering just above it, and the spaceship has a research crew on it who are trying to actually penetrate the planet, penetrate down into this sea that embraces the whole planet. And what happens over time is that as they penetrate deeper and deeper into it, that rather than them getting further into it, some kind of reaction comes back from the planet, whereby they begin, their own unconsciousness begins to unravel itself. The astronauts or the scientists' own subconscious begins to unravel itself. So they all start having fictitious and subconscious characters running around on the spaceship. So it becomes a kind of reversal yeah, well, I guess it's a bit like making art. You're sort of in it and out of it. So
Simon lured you in with his talk of Solaris, and then you got interested in the show.
Yeah, I mean, Qwaypurlake, I don't quite know what that really means. It reminds me of, I went to Greenland some years ago, and there's a town there called Julianahab, which is Danish. But actually the Greenlanders call it Qaqortoq. And it's a much nicer name. In a way, it's quite nice to have words that you don't understand. It's like when you visit a country where you simply don't understand a word of what the people are saying. There's something rather nice about it. It's liberating.
And it's an exhibition, Daphne and Marie will come to you in a moment. It's an exhibition that, for me, seeing it for the first time today, seems full of implied presences of different kinds. Like humans are strangely absent in this place. I mean, you have Ben Rivers's photos of masked figures. You have Elizabeth Frink's kind of striding figures. You have these different kinds of skulls, remnants, ritual objects, a sense of things having been recently absented. And yet, Ian, talking to you earlier, you were talking about your paintings here, that 3 or 4 paintings of 12, were you saying?
It's 3. It's, I don't want to hog things, but it's 3 from a group of 12. And we decided that they're all the same format, they're all the same size, 270 by 190, and we decided we would show the 3 black ones. There are 3 black ones in the groups, the others are either white or red.
And you described them to me as being about a presence of sorts, a kind of human presence.
Well, this is very complicated. I talked about an hour just on this alone. I don't view paintings as things you look at. I view paintings as things you feel. For me, a painting is a felt experience. It's not primarily a visual experience. And so in the paintings, I'm trying to set up some kind of situation whereby the presence of the painting has a similar presence to the human presence. It's not about depicting the body, it's about the notion of presence, the notion of energy, which I guess relates back to Simon's concept for the exhibition.
Yeah, so I think I was trying to create a situation with the exhibition where the audience might feel initially at home, say, with the experience of coming to the gallery. So, you journey through, attractive Somerset countryside. You arrive at the gallery. The gallery is very welcoming. You recognise the architecture. We're not even in a situation where you're encountering some sort of, obtuse, modern contemporary architecture that the gallery has particularly focused on because they think it marks them out to be particularly contemporary. We're basically in a farmyard. So we're kind of familiar with the circumstance. So I wanted people to walk into the exhibition and be drawn backwards and forwards between things they felt very familiar with and things they felt unfamiliar with. So things like the use of photography in the middle 2 spaces, James Revilios's photographs, Jem Southam's, Aaron Schumann's. I wanted those things to be connecting the audience to the countryside they'd moved through to get to the gallery. Mm-hmm. To be kind of making them feel like they knew where they were, and then other things mixed in with them to be pulling them away from that experience. Mm-hmm. So to be familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So ideas of time seeming to change, ideas of space seeming to change, and that thing you comment on about there being very few humans pictured in the exhibition, that's completely pivotal to the way that I went about selecting the work in the show, so that the visitor felt like the human presence, and then other things in the show would feel like presences, like Ian's talking about, that were trying to communicate with them, whether that's Ian's paintings or Kit Poulsen and Alex Baker's transmitter bowls, that you watch for a long time and nothing happens, and then at a certain point the surface of the water vibrates in that very particular way.
There's also a back and forth between different sizes or scales as well, from very large paintings of yours, Ian and Daphne, your cast horse, to Marie's, I think, the smallest works in the show, right?
Yeah, I think you get that award, don't you?
And Marie, I mean, it's interesting to hear Simon start out by talking about language and that being the kind of the basis for the conceit of the show, because I know that for you, languages plays a very important role.
Yeah.
And I should say, Marie and I first met a year or so ago when Marie was Tate St Ives Artist in Residence, which was for an open call for artists based in the Southwest. And we interviewed you when you were in Mumbai via a very dodgy Skype link. And you were talking all about language and mistranslations, and it seemed like a highly appropriate place to meet over this kind of garbled, jumbled line. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about the works that you have in the show, some of which are your teeth.
Yeah, some of which are my teeth. So their works, the teeth work is, I'm not sure if it's really a sculptural work or if it's more of a performance. The last time it was shown last year at the Northern Gallery for Contemporary Art, it was more of a performance, and so they're my wisdom teeth that got removed a few years ago. And for me, the work is essentially in the act of them being sold, and this kind of this active and intimate exchange with somebody for money, and part of my body being removed and then sold to this person, which hasn't happened yet. Not that I'm trying to flog them to you now, but they were included in an exhibition at the Northern Gallery for Contemporary Art, and the curator had them on his desk, and it was this kind of careful act of him looking after them. And please ring me if I start going off on one. And he used to give talks with them in his hand as well, so it's about this kind of intimacy. But for me, the mouth is a very kind of integral part of my work and what I'm thinking about, especially for the past few years, and thinking about language and the mouth as a sculptural space, and how through speech it can be used to kind of through phonetics, and the tongue can be used to kind of carve out these shapes in the mouth, and that's a very intimate thing, especially when you're asking somebody else to speak something for you. So a lot of my work has been around writing scripts for people to speak, and then it's kind of this act of what I was terming, especially at the time when I was talking to Sam, first of all, is a kind of mild terrorism, that you're kind of occupying this space within their body. And so a lot of my interest is about language, but also the slippages between language and this idea of something being the multiple options of the way something is pronounced, but also the sensuality in which something is pronounced as well, and the playfulness in the mouth. And so that's partly what the mouthpiece is about, mouthpiece, which is a cast of the inside of my mouth that I made with a very understanding and forgiving dentist. So it's a cast in lignite resin, and lignite is traditionally it's a mineral that forms jet, which is traditionally used in Victorian mourning jewellery, and it's this idea of kind of this monument to a mouth in a sense, but also something solid that's placed within the mouth that kind of inhibits the movements of the mouth and inhibits language.
Well, I think if you then think about how that works in the show, I think what's interesting to talk about is, because I think the way the exhibition is, what do I call it, framed as like a curatorial narrative or something. I think sometimes people can think that what happens is that if, person A, me, is the curator, I come up with this kind of kooky idea, that it's going to be like this. And then I go out and hunt down artworks, to kind of populate that idea. But I think, like you talking about, Marie being on residence with you in Tate St. Ives, and I think what's really important to talk about is the dialogues you build up with artists as a curator, or as a teacher, or as a writer. If you're working with artists regularly around commissioning, framing, presenting, explaining their work, that process is incredibly two-way. And so when I was coming up with the ideas for the show, all those conversations that I've been having with various people start whizzing through my head. So I first met Marie when I taught her at the art school in Bristol, and your work was quite different then.
It was embroidery, yes. Yeah. It's quite different.
And when you hear the way Marie talks about her work, then those two pieces of work have very particular kind of ways in which they fit into the structure of the way Marie sees her work working. And then in conversations that we have, that's then making me think about different elements of ideas that she's got. And when I was thinking about Qwaypurlake, the idea of language being in the exhibition was going to manifest in the exhibition in a very particular way. And one of those ways was kind of the absence of human language, and then that kind of, so this idea that maybe it was the Qwaypurlake that was trying to talk to you. So the thing that would have voice would be the water, so like David's film or whatever. And then the idea of there being suggestions of human culture and suggestions of human language, but that human language had been stifled or removed or repressed in different ways. So things like Michael Dean's sculptures, and Marie's.
Michael Dean has also made a series of sculptures about the kind of same size as the pieces here, but are these almost like lolling pinkish tongues as well. And I know that for him, he often inscribes the pieces with a kind of almost like rune-like alphabet that sometimes has an afterlife, has a play, has a and then especially with the mouthpiece work that Marie's talking about, it was almost like taking those ideas that Marie has around the work and then knowing those, but then treating the object almost like a foreign thing that you didn't quite understand. And then, for me, I began to imagine it as something that was I think it came from a conversation we had when you were talking about doing a performance and possibly putting rocks in people's mouths. Remember that conversation? Or putting something in, making the audience put something in their mouth. We're doing that after the talk, by the way.
I've got them in my bag. So, it was that I wanted to make like a mouth guard that was based on the shape of my own mouth, and then
but other people had to wear it,
so they had my mouth in theirs.
And that mouthpiece in my head became almost like Sam was talking about earlier, like this kind of ritual object that maybe in some weird ritual that we don't have access to, maybe you had to put that thing in your mouth, So it was a way of suppressing language for some purpose that we're not quite sure of. So like allowing kind of ideas to kind of spiral out like that, and then sit next to other things.
Right. And Daphne, I'm curious, some of this conversation around intimacy and estrangement, and casting too. I think about the work that you've made casting animals, but also your sons as well. And I'm kind of intrigued about how this resonates with your own work.
Well, I think when Simon came, first of all, with the suggestion of the show, what attracted me to it was the slight subversion throughout the show. And from my point of view, the investigation that I'd been doing around the stallion was the death of the plinth and the upturning of the plinth. And
what do you mean by death of the plinth?
Well, I suppose the language the material that I use to make the work is really heavily referenced, and I suppose I don't look at the object that I make, I look at the narrative surrounding the object. And by using marble, I would be thinking of the threads of monumental, funereal, classical, all those kind of vowels that are in that language. And then by getting a stallion and pushing it into a marble piece, you pull those languages together. So that I suppose I looked at it as a act of rebellion, and not just the man on the plinth, but the horse on the plinth. So the plinth,
and it's bringing the horse down to the ground, but then also flipping it,
and it's also scrutinizing it and examining it. But I suppose it's not just about that. There's lots of other investigations that went on at the same time, but some come to the surface and some don't. Some act just as research behind it. But what really interested me was the whole notion of dystopia, and how currently in teen fiction you find things like the Hunger Games. For some reason, there is a big interest amongst teenagers in the notion of dystopia, and whether that's because the world is in a particularly upheaved state, but also I think there's a real sense of the social order becoming permanent and hardening, or calculating, if that's the right word, for them, how they're viewing what's going on. Where for us, I think it was much more of a movable society. But I think with what's happening, society is becoming immobilized, that it isn't allowed to move. So there isn't that. And I think with Simon's show, it's about disenfranchised people, and I suppose subcultures in many ways. And I also was really interested in that kind of hinterland between urban and rural, and how that gets seen as quite a dangerous space, and a space that is occupied by disenfranchised people. And there's loads of literature that exists around that. One particular is Butcher Boy. I can't remember the author, but it's a very rich...
Patrick McGrath.
Yeah. It's a very rich, dangerous area. And what Simon was saying about it being... I feel the show, there has been a sophisticated society, and somehow that's become displaced. And that was my attraction to the show, and I thought that was a good fit for my work, because the work isn't about animals at all, it's about other things. But because the representation is so strong, that's how it gets read first, and then later it gets unfolded.
Can I ask you just very simply about the process of how do you go about casting something like for the Stallion piece? How do you make that?
Well, normally I would start on a body of work and begin to try to find out how it will work. And it's like an investigation process, and there may be small pieces made along the way that they're made, but they're not particularly successful in my head for where I'm trying to succeed. And I felt with the Stallion, I had come to there was no point in making any more of those pieces once it got made. And the process, I intervene in the life cycle of an animal, in the narrative, and at some point I intervene in the carcass of that animal. And we worked over a number of years to build up how we could do that without the body having decayed. And once we started moving to the big animal, there was the whole issue of the bloating and viscerating. I became a vet for a while and spoke to everybody in veterinary school from Edinburgh to Glasgow to Dublin, so to find out how to do it. And then the casting process, I work with very sophisticated model makers who give a lot of their time because they get involved in the investigation the same as myself. And so some of the techniques that we used, we had to invent as we went along. So I'm not telling.
That's okay.
It took so long.
I love that we've covered dentists and vets already as collaborators in this exhibition. I was not expecting that.
And the fabricator, Steve, who made the Stallion for Daphne, helped us install the work and brought this edition of the work down. And talking to him about the process was just those amazing insights you get from the people involved in things that are external to the object. You're looking at it, and there's this amazing, twisted dead horse. And we were installing it together, and it was like a quiet moment. And I was like, it must have been, quite an amazing thing to kind of like actually work with a dead animal of that size to do it. And Steve was like, yeah. And that wasn't the first one. I was like, oh really? He said, yeah, the first one, it got stuck on the M25. And he said, so when it got to us, it took a lot longer to get to us than we wanted. When we opened the back of the lorry, it had blown up like a balloon. He said, so that was the end of that one. And so, but actually there's kind of really like serious things involved in this as well, because as a curator, as an audience member, we go into that gallery and you read the object as it is, And for me, the power of that piece of work is about quite particular things in it. So it's not the fact that it's, that kind of stallion on its back with its legs in the air. It's the fact that it's that kind of animal on its back with its legs in its air, with the skin flayed down its front legs, the fact that it's been hacked open, and sewn back together. So it's like an eviscerated, violated animal. It's not this beautiful, stallion that just happens to have fallen down in some kind of repose. It's a violated thing, And for me, that is a really central part of its power. That, as Daphne was talking about the idea of a classical, stallion on a plinth or something, it's more than just upturning that. It's upturning it and violating it. So, and Daphne and I have talked a lot about how that kind of animal also represents a certain kind of an idea of power, that kind of in aristocratic landowning society or whatever, that before we all had vehicles and everything, the way that you dominated the landscape was through incredibly powerful horses. So it's tied up with ownership, it's tied up with power, and when that thing is then dead on its back and it's been violated as well, it's like it's a whole series of different ideas of power upturned. But that came about through purely pragmatic reasons, didn't it?
But
because the first one,
but I think
bloating.
Yes, absolutely. And then we learned what to do to avoid the bloating, and you have to eviscerate. And we found that out from the horse, the renderer of the horses, because the other thing was, I accessed into the whole meat trade in horse meat, which a lot of the animals are brought from Ireland and the UK and sent on to Belgium and France. And so once I began working, I accessed into this whole community of people, and also the sentiment and the love and for these stallions and the pride in them. And it was really, really hard to access a stallion because they are precious animals, and the relationship with their owner is incredibly particular. And the person who allowed me use this stallion was an old man who had cancer, and he was handing on his farm, and he wanted to look after his stallions, and his way of looking after them was to have them put down, because he didn't want them sold to another farm and another farm and another farm, because they might be abused without him being around. So when we did the whole process and the piece went back and was shown in Ireland, the invigilators in the gallery told me that an old man came in and he sat in the gallery for about an hour, and when he was going he said, "That's me." And I thought it was really poignant, because it was almost like a reflection of his maleness, and also the fact he'd had cancer operations and everything. So there's very poignant moments within the whole narrative of the actual sheer ugliness of capturing a body.
I've been struck by how in different ways each of you have talked about language, or the role of language in your work or thinking. And Ian, I know that we were talking earlier, you studied literature and you went on from there to painting. You didn't go to art school, and I know you've made different kind of series that refer to different works of literature, like Four Quartets and T.S. Eliot. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that kind of, what is the role of reading, or what's the kind of relationship of language to your work, or your kind of daily practice in the studio?
Well, I read every day. I'm a prolific reader. Books are probably more important to me than the visual world in that sense, in terms of an impetus to make work. Then I'm as likely to find it in the line of a book than I am in actually seeing work. It's an interesting area what Daphne was just speaking about. I was just thinking of trying to find parallels within my own practice as to what she was speaking about. I think I essentially deal in abstractions. I'm not interested in anecdote, I'm not interested in narrative, I'm not interested in what for me are the easy way of understanding art. It's easy to understand a piece of art through a narrative. It seems to me it's much more difficult to come to it in a much deeper, more fundamental way. And so I'm actually interested in making work and actually understanding the world through a series of abstractions, not through the norms of narrative.
And for the first decade or so of your work, it was rooted quite closely, as I understand it, in the landscape,
yes,
right? Before you turned more towards.
But I slowly moved away from that. It slowly progressed away.
And what role does place play now in these abstract paintings of yours?
Well, I suppose that was one of the other things that drew me to participating in the exhibition. I've lived in this area now for 25 years, having moved from London. People always asked me, what was the key factor in moving to Dorset, and the assumption was that it was place in the sense of space, but actually it isn't. For me, it's actually to do with time. I think painting is much more about time than it is about space, and my notion of place is actually much more about time than it is about space. So it's those kind of areas that intrigue me. We live in a highly charged, extremely fast world now, with the contemporary media, everything is moving so quickly. And one of the areas that painting, I think, can still be involved with is actually trying to engage with another level of time, a level of time which actually is not of that kind of pace. And I think place, the notion of place, somehow still roots us back to that. It still pulls us back to a notion of time which is actually displaced from the digital world. I mean, if you take the analogy of the land underneath us and the digital world passing over the top of it, then they coexist in some kind of strange world. There's an enormous gap between them, and it's that older time that I'm actually interested in.
Marie, does any of this thinking about place connect with you? I mean, as someone who's lived a fairly itinerant life, in a sense, in the last couple of years of having been based in St Ives for several months and then moving to study in London, but yet also being kind of a semi-regular visitor back to the southwest. I wonder how this idea of kind of making work that belongs from or grows out of a certain place or set of conditions, how that informs your work.
Yeah. I really don't think it's in the same way, I think. Although, it's a very difficult question. It's not something that I really think about that much. But definitely when I was in St Ives, there was very much a feel that got into my work, and my work changed quite a lot, or what I was interested in making changed quite a lot when I was there due to certain influences. So I started making a lot of ceramic pieces, and that was definitely influenced by Bernard Leach and the pottery that was in St Ives. And I was doing a ceramic course, and I was also using the ceramic facilities in Plymouth, but I really don't think that I think about place in the same way. It's more, I think it's definitely more about the body and not necessarily the body in a place. It's about kind of this centralised experience.
But for me, I think there is a link, because I think what Ian was talking about.
I'm curious. I'm curious if, for instance, Marie, if you would place. So in a sense, you're place inside yourself, not outside of it.
Yeah.
I mean, Daphne, where would you place it?
I think place is non-place. It's about non-place, and for me, it's not having a place.
But I think hearing Ian talk about time, like when saying, "Well, why did you move to Dorset?" Surely it's because it's got chocolate boxy hills and it's all green and lovely, and that's the antidote to London or something. And then hearing Ian talk about time, and that you're seeing painting fundamentally about time. For me, as a non-maker, a lot of my experiences with artworks that really engage me are about a relationship of time with the world that an artist has created, conveyed through a particular encounter. So standing in front of one of Ian's paintings, for me, standing in front of Marie's mouthpiece or something, the experience I'm having actually is very similar. And it's a demand, a very nice demand, but a demand put upon me by the work to spend time with it and try and unpick it, and unravel it. And this idea of kind of Ian's comment to Marie about placing place within yourself or something, I actually think a lot of really good artists, what they're trying to do is create, in a way, a time and place and sense that is held within their work, which touches the world in lots of different ways. It's kind of the world but separate from the world. And what it demands of you is to kind of spend time with it and inhabit it. And I suppose in a way the exhibition is like a expanded, narrativized kind of version of that process, that actually what it's asking you to do is be drawn into its time frame, and then have to have these relationships with the different works in the show, and they try and slow you down and move you between them, and there are little bits of connection and that kind of steer you around, but it's a lot about separate and overlapping relationships.
I noticed, Daphne, the exhibition you have later in the year at Arnolfini is going to be called Emotional Architecture. Archaeology.
Yeah.
And I wondered what that phrase means to you, because it felt like it was something that I could, looking at, say, the Hans Koper ceramic pieces in this show, they always read like arrowheads or something to me, something that have been unearthed. But I wondered for you what emotional archaeology means.
Oh gosh, I suppose it's objects, like what you were saying, I think, was about the object being non-representational and not carrying narrative. And I think I probably agree in the same way that these objects that you dig up or that you you make them into some other material, they pull up different emotions, or they pull different threads of narrative and emotion. It doesn't mean they carry a single narrative, but they pulled up this layering of emotion. And I think it's an area that I do play with, that you're giving something possibly very emotional, but it's put through material like tinfoil, where the emotion is drained out. So you're called over, but you're held back. And that's something I use a lot in my work. And I think when Simon's talking about the notion of time, this time that the film, the book that he's talking about exists in, I think it is a no time, because there's ghosts. Although it's very contemporary, it's also haunted. And that's something I hope is within my own work, but I find really within each person's work. And the Maria's with the archaeology teeth and strange notion of woven time.
That's interesting. I was struck kind of moving through the exhibition that I kept coming back to this question of, I was like, what kind of tense is this happening in? Because there are a number of artists in the show that connected very closely with mid-century, whether Peter Lanyon or Hans Koper or others. So, and I maybe this is my kind of St. Ives context speaking, I often always relate everything back to that moment anyway. But actually there is also these kind of possible, dystopia is a kind of a bad future, it's always in the future tense. But there is that kind of oscillation throughout the show. These kinds of things that seem like very deep past, and yet maybe the kind of near future as well.
And also I think the word dystopia, it's about disappointment, and the utopia has failed, and there's a lot at the moment about utopia, the book. The Austen Wells must be an anniversary or something, is it? But there is this, and I think maybe we've had the Arab Spring, and I think if you look at Don McQuillan's photography, it's repetitive. It's like we've had these terrible crises over and over again. And although it's terribly horrific what's in the photographs, it's incredibly human, because you find a hand. Some of the photographs you find a hand, and the emotion that's imbued from that hand and the tenderness, even in this terribly violent situation. And I suppose in Simon's show there is a real sense of that human tenderness, although they're completely absent in the show.
Yeah, it's really. I was thinking about you mentioned the Solaris, and look, going back to that early '60s moment when that was written. There was also the J.G. Ballard book, The Drowned World.
Yeah.
It was really common for a time to always imagine the future as in this kind of ruins, submerged, and so on. And yet, that kind of that image now of subaquatic, submerged cities is now like horribly familiar in the last 10 years. If we think of of Sandy, of Katrina, of the 2004 tsunami, and there's a way in which that kind of earlier idea of a sci-fi dystopia is just now becoming incredibly close. Right, these are familiar images.
And what was really interesting about the period that those novels were being written in, especially the Russian science fiction, like Stanislaw Lem and the Stagatsky brothers, was that when they were writing in the Soviet Union, you couldn't write about politics. If you start writing, a novel about the state, you were just going to disappear. But they could use science fiction to talk about politics. So, Solaris is really about politics, it's about colonialism, it's about power and domination, the idea of exploration being fueled by, not by grand positive narratives. Stagatsky brothers' books like Roadside Picnic, which went on to be made into Stalker, the film, these things are about. They seem like dystopian science fiction, but really they're talking about the apparatus of power and the position of people inside systems. And on one level, Qwaypurlake is this kind of dystopian science fiction about a body, a kind of intelligent body of water, deliberately stealing that straight from Solaris, consciously stealing that. Put into a kind of rural English context that we can all be familiar with, but through sort of running through the exhibition, it's like a allegory about power or something, The water body is kind of power.
How do you see your relationship as curator to this exhibition in relationship to power? I mean, in that it's quite an authored show from this quite personal conceit, this road that links this place with where you live. This kind of it's almost like a world that you have imagined and then you have populated or depopulated.
I think that's a really
good
interesting question. Yeah, because it brings us on to that idea about what do curators do and like what is curating. And
go on.
For me, I wrote about this particularly. Elephant Magazine asked me to write about this show in relationship to that, and I think sometimes, and I've talked to all of these guys about it in making the exhibition, that we have certain ideas about hierarchy, that are possibly external to situations. So people imagine that in making an exhibition like this, like I said earlier, I'd have this idea and then I go out and find the work that kind of illustrates it or something. But the idea only exists because of the conversations that I've had with the artists who were in the show. So it starts off as a kind of slightly wobbly formed thing with certain ideas in it which aren't really particularly solid, but even those ideas come from an accumulation of artworks that have gathered in my head, with certain connections and overlaps between themselves and between other ideas that I bump into from literature or politics or whatever, or Daphne's phone.
Sorry.
Yeah, and that's quite a good illustration of we were talking over lunch about, these things aren't separate. It's not work and life and art and life. All of these things are kind of woven in together. And the process of making an exhibition like this for me is like a constant backwards and forwards between gathered artworks crossing over.
Sorry,
Have you finished?
Kids.
Have you quite finished?
This is a great example of artists undermining curatorial authority.
I've had it. I can't even make them be quiet. It's the perfect example of the true manifestation of power. It's actually our children. Interrupting a talk. So all I was going to say was actually it's a collaboration. It's easy to imagine it from the outside, as you have like the institution, and that's the big powerhouse. Then you have the kind of organ of the institution in the curator, and then you have the exhibition, and the artists all slot into it. But I mean, a lot of you've got the little booklet that goes with the show on your laps, because it was on the chairs when you came in, and in there's a kind of little short piece of fiction that goes with the show. But that was collaboratively written by myself and a number of the artists in the exhibition by exchanging bits of writing. So you read it as one voice, but it was actually written by about 6 people together. And that's a really good illustration of how the exhibition was formed. It was going backwards and forwards with the artists about ideas, about which works would be in it. So my ideas were constantly changing. So yes, it's my exhibition, and yes, it came from my idea, but that idea is formulated in a very shared way by the people in it. So for me, it's a group activity, I suppose. Just happens to have my name in a funny way underneath it.
I think that might be a good moment to move over to questions, if there are questions. I know is there a roaming microphone somewhere around? So I think we're recording. Just one moment. Lucy, just over here.
Hi. I'm really interested to hear you talking about the role of the curator. Hi, Simon. And Daphne. I've commissioned twice with Daphne, which is great. So it's fantastic to see your work here today. I'm really interested in this role of the curator because many artists are quite critical of curators in that they come on and sort of enforce their ideas and press the work into a kind of mould. But I recently saw Kit show up in London, Kit Polson, and I'm interested because I haven't seen Kit's work for a little while. I actually own one of his paintings, and I think that this show has informed his work. So I wonder whether perhaps the artist could take this sort of notion that when they get invited to do a show like this, does that actually change the way that you move on in your practice?
No. I mean, no, let's be realistic. It's one exhibition. I have 3 paintings and I do large museum shows all over the place.
They're not even new paintings, are they?
No, they're not even new. So, I mean,
you wouldn't give me any of the new ones.
The reason one participates in a group exhibition, if one does it, is either because you either like the space or you like the curator, or the premise of the exhibition has some kind of integrity to it. What I liked about Simon's proposal was that it was very open-ended, but at the same time it had a kind of inner strength to it. And it had a kind of a level of inquiry. I got the feeling he didn't know exactly what he was doing, and I actually liked that because it meant that it could evolve. I mean, there's nothing worse than when someone comes to the studio and they say, "Well, actually, I've got this idea for a show, and I'd like this one, that one, and that one," and you say, "Okay, thanks very much." It's done and dusted. But one felt with Simon that actually the concept was evolving, and it brought a kind of integrity to the project, which I personally liked.
I think for me, again, it was Simon, and it was the contrariness of it. Sorry, Simon.
That's fine.
And I guess the same thing, the level of inquiry that and risk taking. I like the idea of the risk and the risk of the narrative.
Yeah, there are some risky relationships that could have been a disaster.
Absolutely, and also the fact that the artists were all put in. People's work was on top of each other and had different, well, in a closeness that wouldn't usually be allowed in galleries. And yeah, I like that challenging side of it.
I think, I mean, for me, exhibition should open things up rather than close things down, right? I mean, I remember this show that was at the New Museum in New York several years ago, and it's called something like The Free Press or The Newspaper or something, and it was basically a survey of 100 artists with nothing to do with one another, all of whom happened to have made works that included a newspaper in it at some point. And like, that was the show, you know, and there's no way that's going to open up any of those kinds of works or ask new questions or anything.
Well, so effectively, they're an illustration, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Of actually not a very interesting idea.
Yeah, and I think that's it, a very, very narrow conceit which actually stops them being read in any other kind of a way.
Yeah, but I think that maybe what Tessa is hinting at is exactly that. What's good curating and what's bad curating, and when does curating, as a curator, like what Ian was saying about. You know, I didn't seem to know exactly what I was doing. I take that as a compliment, rather than. Yeah, exactly. Because it is what I feel like you want to achieve is the opposite of what Sam just described. You know, and that is like the kind of worst example of kind of institutional curating, where there isn't really a creative investment, an intellectual inquiry from the curator into how the work's brought together. And I think that's disrespectful to the artists, disrespectful to an audience. You know, it's kind of disingenuous kind of position.
Something Marie mentioned earlier about the curator in, was it Sunderland's?
Yeah.
Who was taking care of your teeth. And I mean, it reminded me, it's often mentioned, but the original meaning of the word curator was someone who cares for artworks. But I was intrigued about how you almost, it sounded like you built that into the show, that there was this responsibility to kind of to care for, to handle, to keep safe.
Very much, and it was almost unsolicited as well. He didn't ask for it. I just said, you're having this. Yeah, I curated that myself. I just said, you're having this, and well, we discussed what was going to be shown, and then I said, you're going to look after my teeth. So please take care of them. But I think something that interests me about the question about how your work might change after an exhibition, sometimes personally I find that it does, because often when there is that intellectual investment in the work and you have different conversations around the work and it provides a different context and it's almost an insight that you haven't had in your work, or especially this one when there were so many different tenses and you get to see your work in a new light, then sometimes it does, for me personally, reveal something about the work that I hadn't seen myself, and then it causes me to reflect on it, and then perhaps it does steer the direction in a small way or maybe in a bigger way. But I find that I really enjoy being in group shows because of that different context and seeing how things might be different.
Thank you. Were there any more questions? Yeah, just up at the oh, sorry.
It's the naughty corner, I think. I'm really interested in what you were saying, Simon, about the curating it for the audience, the way people move around, because it's not a conversation that's raised very often, and it's something that I'm always fascinated by. But to me, there's a real coherence to the curating and the idea. I'd really like to know whether the audience get it, and does it matter whether they actually get that when they come, or are you happy for them to find their own experience of the show?
One of the things that you can't control everything, you know, and one of the classic things is I try to be really, really thoughtful about how Hauser Wirth works. And having conversations with Alice or Lucy about, so people move around the galleries in this way, right? They come in, they go to the reception desk, they go into the threshing barn, they move through. So that kind of guided my whole way of curating the show. Completely, it's totally fixed in my head. You kind of have introduction with David Wojtiewicz's kind of film in Threshing Barn. You go through these two kind of more museological rooms. You end up in the big kind of Rhodes Gallery, where it's like this kind of semi-apocalyptic kind of theatrical kind of setting. And then completely just edited out of my head, and in the other gallery is Don McCullum. And everybody's going to go straight to Don McCullum and go round the show in reverse. So, you know, do people get it? Yeah, I think they do, yeah. But you also have to kind of, I mean, part of my head was thinking that, like, it kind of happened when we were installing a few times, when I was thinking, people are going to walk around it the other way, aren't they? You know? So because it has to kind of survive, like on its own in a way. It doesn't need a guide. If it needs a guidebook to make you get anything from it, then it's just obtuse, So I hope that, Ian talking before about he sees paintings as something that you feel. I wanted there to be an atmosphere in the exhibition through the way the works are combined, so that you don't have to know exactly about what it's about on these various different levels, but you should be able to feel your way into it. And as long as people get a feeling near to the feeling I was hoping for, then I think that's what I want, because I don't want this discussion we just had about curating. It's not a prescriptive thing, it doesn't have a definitive meaning. It has a set of relationships in it and a set of ideas in it. And I think when I was at college, I first started, I was like 18, I started encountering poetry properly. And I had some friends who were earnest young poets. And we used to have earnest conversations about poetry in our student halls. And that T.S. Eliot quote about, I think he was asked what the wasteland was supposed to mean, and he said it means something different to everybody who encounters it. And that it kind of sounds very easy, but it's actually an essential conversation about artwork and audience. And if anything if it means the same to everybody, and if it can be too easily described, it actually doesn't have autonomy as a thing in the world separate from people. And I think that's really important. So I think people will have their own journeys through it, and I think having Marie and Daphne and Ian here, and all of their work is about a whole series of much more complicated and different things to the things the exhibition is about, and they just come into this for a moment and then go off again, and I think that's kind of key, I suppose, that there's you want people to kind of go with you on a kind of little exploration, but then for it to touch onto much bigger things that are external and go out to that.
Thank you. There was another question here.
First of all, I come from an engineering background. I see things in terms of nuts and bolts and steel girders and everything else. It is strange then, I have a daughter that's turned out to be an art historian, and she has interested me in art generally. And she said to me once when I was criticising abstract art that art is either imitative, if that's the word, or derivative, and truly you should move to derivative, and that has led to abstract art rather than just people painting bowls of roses or whatever. And so I have come to have some sympathy for abstract art. I'm sorry about this. You've all explained very eloquently your particular what you have created and how it's pulled together as one general theme. My fear here is that people that actually come here, that let's say bother to come here in that sense, it's a bowl of teeth, funny shaped head. Oh, it's a bit of a nice horse. Not quite noticing that it's been eviscerated and some of the skin. My question is, how do you stop abstract art being a bit clubby and take it out to a wider audience?
But can I answer this? Why should it go to a wider audience? Not everybody watches football, not everybody knits, not everybody rides horses, not everybody walks a dog. Why should everybody be interested in abstract art?
No, not everybody, but to a wider audience.
What you need to understand, I think the crux of the question seems to be to do with the nature of meaning. Art doesn't mean anything. It just has possibilities, but it doesn't have an explicit meaning. Just as if we speak about the curated exhibition, it doesn't have a definitive meaning. It has a multiplicity of possibilities. A painting has exactly the same parameters. It has a multiplicity of possibilities. You have the choice to either engage with it or not. If you engage with it, then you can take the engagement deeper. If you don't engage with it, then you can't. It's a bit like anything in life. If you don't drive a car very often, you're not very good at it. If you drive a car regularly, it comes easy and it feels very natural. If you look at paintings a lot, it becomes easy and it becomes natural. You don't have to keep going back to this base of what does it mean, what does it mean. It's enough to actually just find the engagement. You don't get in a car and ask, what does it mean to drive a car? You just drive it. Or when you kick a football about, or when you make a bowl of soup. You don't ask, what does it mean to make a bowl of soup? It's the same thing with paintings or any other piece of art. It's a question of engagement. If you want to engage with it, then the possibility's there and you can open it up. But if you don't, then you can't. And it's a question of generosity. The artist tries to be as generous possible as they possibly can in their work. They try to give as much as they can. Some give more than others, but nevertheless, they all try to give. And the question to the audience is simple: how much are you prepared to give back? If you're not prepared to give much back, you're not going to get anything from it. If you're prepared to give a lot back, you might get something from it. It's a question of attitude.
With the royal academician, but some art has been very powerful and has spoken to abstract art to a very, very wide audience. I'm thinking of Guernica or something like that.
Well, Guernica was abstract. It's a figurative painting.
It was quite subversive, and it had hidden texts in its time. It was subversive. I mean, art can be powerful, and if it's I mean, football has a wide audience. Boxing has a wide audience. Can
I take you back to the beginning of your question? When you say go out to a broad audience, is it this situation that you think doesn't communicate with a broad audience, like Hauser and Wirth? I mean, what are you talking about? Art in general, the gallery we're in now.
Well, no, I'm just talking about
trying to work it out.
I think if you, I mean, it sounds snobby, but if you talk about the average person, and I would have included myself in that, certainly before my daughter opened my eyes to a degree. And they see, that somebody has put a pile of bricks in the Tate, the classic one, and he earns 6,000 quid. They will take a very cynical attitude to that. And you need somebody on behalf of the people to explain to people that there's meaning to it.
Yeah, well, I think lots of people are actually engaged in doing that, and their whole careers are based on that. And I think that what's kind of interesting about what you're talking about is basically about education. It's about at what point in your life are you given access to culture in different ways. One of the things that I'm doing at the moment through Foreground that Lucy mentioned that I run with my partner Tabitha is we're doing a series of 10 commissions with contemporary artists who people might consider to be conceptual. It's even worse than abstract. They're not even painters like he is. They work with ideas in different ways, and their work manifests in different ways. But what we're doing with them is we're taking them into primary schools, and they're working with specific primary schools to make a new piece of art for that school that will kind of live with that school. And what they're doing is they're having conversation with the teachers, conversation with the pupils, and Daphne's going to be doing one of these with me. And they're working out how do you make a new piece of art for a school full of children that's meaningful to that environment and meaningful to those kids. And what's really fundamentally interesting for me about that process is that you're then going to have kids from 5 to 11 going into their school and having a piece of art in their lives, in their school, in a meaningful way that they're going to be referencing all the time. And one of the head teachers said to me, and he works in the catchment of his school in Bristol is really deprived, and he said, because a lot of the work, like public art that gets done through sort of planning situations, is often asking artists to make something in the physical infrastructure of a building that's a bit more arty. So can we have an artier wall or an artier bench or something like that? So it touches on design a lot. And there was a kind of expectation that these works might be a bit like that. And this head teacher, Tony, said to me, he said, these kids will never go to galleries, they won't go to museums, they don't have the opportunity at home, and I want them to be able to come into school, be having a maths lesson, look at the huge bit of art that they've got in their common area. And he said, I want to take them round, sit them on the ground and say, right, we're going to talk about shape today, or we're going to talk about, fractions, or we're going to talk about this, and we're going to look at this painting and work it out. So fundamentally, this idea that art is accessible to a small elite and not to the broader average person, it's all to do with education. Like, I don't understand opera, I don't understand cricket, I don't understand them because I haven't had the opportunity. They weren't part of my life as a kid. I didn't grow up with them. So I think a lot of the time it's about actually taking the natural openness and inquisitiveness that we have as children. Like, if I bring my 6-year-old round a show at Hauser Wirth, he'll just be all over it, He doesn't give a monkeys about the fact that it's worth a lot of money or anything like that. So, my wife and I, our hearts are going like, oh, just don't touch it. And he's like, but look, it's like a so-and-so, it's like a this, it's a that, and he's just, what happens is it gets educated out of us. The inquisitiveness and the openness that we have as children gets educated out of us. And in the UK, unfortunately, part of our education system palpably educates culture out of people. Some things are fine, some things aren't. At the moment, I was looking at the kind of recommended primary school allocation to art and literature a week, and it's not mandatory at the moment for kids who are under 11. 55 minutes recommended engagement with art a week. 55 minutes engagement with literature a week. Some schools don't even give their kids that. And so that's how you change it. That's how the possibilities that Ian are talking about, the idea of time we've talked about, sitting in front of a painting and thinking, what is that thing? What does it make me feel? How are we given the permission to put ourselves in that position? We're given the permission through education.
I think we've finished up with the villain. I'm completely on side and I love the exhibition. All I'm saying is it's a great pity it can't go to a wider audience.
Can I just say, almost the positive spin on some of what Simon just said, which I agree with entirely, and there is a huge crisis, I think, in education, how the arts are being stripped out of education from preschool through to university, and who has access to that university education right now. But you mentioned wide audience and you mentioned football, and it's actually true right now there are more people that go to museums in the UK than go to football matches. So, if you're kind of using that metric, museums have never been more popular. The most visited are museums of modern art. It's like 6 million people go there every year. So those things have shifted really in a way that if you would go back 30 years, that level of audience would have been unrecognisable.
Maybe we could ask Hauser to tour the show around a few more galleries in the UK. I agree with you, it's very good and it needs to be shared. Yeah.
One more question here.
Does this mean that Hauser Wirth is going to put on more shows inviting local curators?
I've no idea. I couldn't possibly talk for that. Lucy's run out of the building just as that question.
It would be nice to see. This doesn't work. I don't know why I'm holding it.
It'd
be nice to see more stuff. I really enjoyed the show.
Thank you.
It'd be really great to see more work like it.
Thank you. There is maybe time for one final question, just in the middle there.
Thanks very much. It's Ian's thing. I'm a local, and I think there's lots and lots of local people who do come to Hauser Wirth. I've been to this exhibition 3 times, and I learned something different each time. And now it's kind of multiplied up again just by listening to you guys today. And just something else that went with Is it Teresa? Sorry.
Marie. Very close.
Your thing about the stones and the mouth. I'm not sure which book or which play, but Sam Beckett does it.
Tell me, is it not I?
Yes,
Mouth? Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
That just came straight to me. And the other thing was your quote. I put my glasses on and off, but your medallion thing is like is it meant to be? Because you're talking about words all the time.
Yeah.
And it's like a quotation mark in a cartoon.
Thank you very much.
I think that's a lovely place to finish. So please join me in thanking our panel.